Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome to the inaugural World Cities Summit Science of Cities Symposium, organized by the Center for Livable Cities, Ministry of National Development. It is my pleasure to share some thoughts on leveraging the emerging science of cities and how Singapore is seeking to apply it to urban planning and governance and to build a sustainable city fit for the future and its many challenges. Now, cities are one of humanity's greatest inventions as centers of learning, innovation, commerce, and productivity. Today, they're also home to a majority of the world's population. But new and unprecedented challenges will determine the future of cities. Climate change, aging populations, a rapidly globalizing workforce. These will all increase the burden on social and fiscal support. The COVID-19 pandemic showed up vulnerabilities in supply chains and presented new models of work. Cities require agility in urban governance to develop in a sustainable, inclusive, and equitable manner. Cities are complex systems comprising unique, heterogeneous agents operating at multiple scales. Complexity emerges when agents, like people, households, enterprises, act on individual decisions, interact with each other, experience feedback, and then adapt their actions as influenced by the environment. So to understand how a city works, we must understand not only the behavior of each person living in it, but also how they interact with one another and how their collective behavior manifests over time. Now, the investigation of functional subjects like transport, environment, energy, public health, social dynamics, even economics, has often encouraged the assumption that when these smaller parts are each better understood and reassembled, that the whole will behave like the sum of its parts and approximate the real world. But we have found that reductionism as an approach has not been very useful in predicting the behavior of complex systems like cities, which are really system of systems. So to deal with long-term challenges that face the city, we have to better understand the interdependency of energy, resources, environmental, ecological, economic, social, political systems. We seek an integrated framework to understand the relationship between human-engineered systems, both social and physical, and the natural environment to better plan and manage our cities. Over these last 2 decades, a science of cities has emerged to integrate different strands of urban research into a coherent viewpoint. This embraces an interdisciplinary approach to scientific knowledge, production, and application. Governments often have to make decisions and develop plans and policies under conditions of incomplete information, uncertainty. The challenge for the planner is to make plans and policies that are robust while having constant transition arrangements, even as assumptions, conditions, and technologies evolve and change. In the most recent review of Singapore's long-term plan, a new and less deterministic approach was taken to navigate uncertainties of the future and encourage our planners to explore fresh strategies. We need support by a scientific approach that harnesses foresight and navigates complex needs with optionality and flexibility. Singapore and many cities in the world today are in a much better place to manage the complexities of our built environment due to the changing possibilities from data. Where earlier quantitative studies were methodologically challenged by lack of data, the world today is one of data abundance and increasing computational capacity. The Singapore Smart Nation Initiative is an exercise to systematically capture the data created by agents such as people, public and private institutions, markets, and networks. Their interactions contribute to the creation of what we now refer to as big data. And when combined with high-performance computing, increasingly powerful data analytics, artificial intelligence, such big data can provide useful insights to new patterns and trends. This powerful capability is vital for the science of cities. The tools of complexity science, combined with insights from big data and fields in social science and citizen science, can help us understand better how the city works and allow us to identify when and how to intervene to narrow the gaps between urban planning and everyday lived experiences. Now, in complex systems like cities, exploration and experimentation are often more valuable than relying on predictions from analytical models. To supplement tried and tested approaches, we will experiment in Singapore with new solutions, pilot programs, prototypes, and beta versions to deal with complex systems. Research from the emerging science of cities has tremendous potential to support this. Tools from complexity science like network analysis and agent-based modeling have emerged as means to understand the properties and dynamics of urban processes. The Center for Livable Cities has the Complexity Science for Urban Solutions pilot project funding program to explore the use of such tools in our local context. The program brings together interdisciplinary teams from academia and practice to study cross-domain issues that manifest across different aspects of the urban environment. Over the past 2 years, government agencies worked in close collaboration with various parties, such as the Singapore University of Technology and Design, the Nanyang Technological University, and the Singapore ETH Centre's Future Cities Lab, to take the science into practice. Some of the completed projects will be featured in today's panel sessions. This effort to develop a holistic understanding of behaviors and trends at different urban scales looks beyond the traditional boundaries of scientific institutions. It's a foundational step in developing a science of cities in Singapore. This journey in developing a science of cities is a collaborative one. We need to form partnerships among companies, government agencies, and the community. The Center for Livable Cities is leading the effort to build a collaborative ecosystem for practical research and to position Singapore as a global center for science of cities research. At this World City Summit, CLC will be launching its inaugural WCS Knowledge Councils, the Science of Cities Knowledge Council, and the Urban Resilience Knowledge Council. The Knowledge Councils bring together eminent thought leaders from diverse sectors to inform futures thinking and solutions in Singapore and other cities. CLC is also collaborating with World Scientific Publishing Company to launch a new international journal, the International Journal for Smart and Sustainable Cities. This journal will welcome academic papers, insights and opinions, policy notes from researchers, practitioners, and policymakers to circulate research outcomes, accumulate and integrate scholarly knowledge on topics such as complexity science and regenerative cities. This Science of Cities Symposium will be convened annually, and it will attempt to gather the best minds in urban research to advance knowledge creation. Research on new ideas to foster more resilient and sustainable urban environments will be launched in the coming years under the Research, Innovation and Enterprise, or RIE 2025 program, to further integrate scientific knowledge with urban planning practice. These grant calls will fund investigation into different aspects of urban planning, including inclusive and adaptive towns for all ages, the circular economy for sustainable development, and symbiotic green-blue environments for high-quality living. An emerging science of cities is transforming the way we understand the urban environment. Singapore has the ambition to be one of the centers for developing this science. Our experience with R&D into urban matters, abundance of data, our range of new research initiatives places us in a good position to collaborate with the research ecosystem. Thank you all for attending this inaugural session of the Science of Cities Symposium, and I hope you will find the discussions stimulating and fruitful. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, and let me begin by thanking CLC for inviting me to come and speak at the World City Summit on a topic that is a favorite of mine. And as a practitioner who applies complexity theory in a variety of fields, from financial markets to economics, and yes, to cities as well, I hope to be able to give you some flavor of how these ideas get implemented. But since I am the first speaker in the cycle, let me spend a minute just to explain what on earth is a complex system, as opposed to a complicated system. A complex system is a system which has a large number of moving parts which are continuously interacting with each other. These interactions are not always predictable. They are evolving, they are feedback loops. So this is a world of butterfly effects, feedback loops, unintended consequences. And I want to contrast this with, say, a complicated system like a car. A car may be complicated, but it is not a complex system. It is neither adapting. All the parts in the car, assuming it's functioning the way it's supposed to, are essentially interacting in a very premeditated way. So a car does not evolve, presumably. So given that, now that you've understood the big difference between these two systems, let me say that there are many systems that follow this sort of logic. Financial markets, economies, the English language, Hinduism as a religion. So there are many forms of complex systems, and you will by this point recognize that cities are complex systems that are continuously evolving. They're bits and pieces, whether it's people or buildings and institutions and all kinds of other dynamics continuously interacting with each other, and of course, through feedback loops evolving forward. Now, why does this change the way we make policies about cities? In order to understand this, you need to step back a little bit and understand how policies used to be made in much of the 20th century. The thinking of the 20th century was very much derived from Newtonian mechanics. This was true of many fields, including economics and financial markets, but it's particularly true for cities, where there was a very famous urban designer and architect called Le Corbusier, who called cities machines for living. So they literally had a mechanical view of the world. And the idea was that just like you design a machine, you sit down and you think through what an ideal city would be, you design it up front, and you implement it as well as you can. And that was what great city design and planning was all about. And there are many cities that were built like this. There were very famously Canberra and Brasilia. But since I come from India, there was a city called Chandigarh that was designed with this logic. Incidentally, there are parts of Singapore designed, like Pasir Ris, for example, designed with this logic and hugely influential, so much so it is still encoded in many ways in many of our building codes and so on. The contrast with Singapore, the contrast with Chandigarh, interestingly, is Singapore. And I'd like to tell this story because Chandigarh essentially became a fully fledged city in 1965, in exactly the same year that Singapore became an independent country. Now, when Singapore became an independent country, it was a place with many people at that time thought not much of a future. It didn't have resources, it didn't even have enough water for itself. I believe it still doesn't have enough water for itself. It was full of slums, and there was, in fact, a lot of concerns about where Singapore would go. The only asset it had was a couple of ports that the British had left behind as they withdrew. But interestingly, the political leadership of that time decided to use that for something new, which was for a container shipment port. They moved into light manufacturing and so on in the 1960s and 70s, so much so that it moved up the value chain, and that by 1980 it was not worthwhile making cheap knockoff garments here. So they moved into electronics, and when I was a kid, whenever somebody in my extended family came to Singapore, we would tell them to go to Mustafa and buy cheap electronics. And by the 90s, Singapore had still moved up the value chain, and it already become too expensive a place to do that. And so then moved up the value chain further into financial markets, into entertainment. This building is a testimony to that change, to education, and so on and so forth. Now, why is this an interesting story? It's an interesting story because throughout this entire phase, remember Chandigarh? It continues to be basically an administrative town. It's basically a subsidy scheme for civil servants. This model of Chandigarh, which was essentially the template of urban design in India, was so popular that effectively all cities since then have used this as a template. And even Chandigarh itself has remained frozen, but at least it functions as an administrative hub. Most of the other places where this model was used was an abysmal failure. So now, how did cities evolve in the last few years with this sort of rigid planning? Well, they evolved by essentially ignoring the plan. So just outside of Delhi, there is a town called Gurgaon. Gurgaon is now a very glitzy town. It's full of also software firms, startups, back office outsourcing, all the stuff that you relate when you think about India very often these days goes to Bangalore and to Gurgaon. Now, the most interesting thing to know about the planning of Gurgaon is that most of those buildings you see there are technically illegal, or at least were till recently, till basically they were regularized in some fashion. And yet, if we had actually imposed the master plans of these urban spaces and stuck with them, we would have essentially, these places would just not have evolved. So India's urbanism is happening outside of its urban planning and management. Because if we actually tried to do it within that context, it just wouldn't work. Now, this is not necessarily a good thing, because it does mean that it is very chaotic. Urban evolution happens in completely unmanaged ways in which infrastructure simply struggles to keep up. You may have all those fancy glitzy buildings in many of these new areas, but just outside them, the roads will be all broken up, or the garbage cleaning has not yet kept up with this evolution of this new area, and so on and so forth. So here is where complexity theory comes in. Rather than have this mechanical top-down view of how these cities will evolve, which, as I said, either you will end up choking it off, or you will allow it to happen in an unpredictable way, much better to have a system of feedback loops, where using all the great data now we have, especially for cities, satellite data, for example, is extremely useful, data on how new emerging areas are turning up, we can then intervene and manage this process. So, whenever I like to go to an urban conference in India and I want to irritate traditional urban designers in India, I like to ask them, so which is the best city in India? And very often they will say, even today, say Chandigarh, despite obviously that model doesn't work. And then I very often ask them, which city in the world do you think is the best planned? And most of them will also say Singapore. But I hope I've convinced you that actually they are from completely opposite ends of the planning spectrum. And the models they have used is exactly opposite. If any city in India ever ends up a bit like Singapore, it would probably be managing Gurgaon better, i.e. the untamed energy of some of these newer parts, newer cities in India needs to be managed better. They don't need to be planned better in the rigid sort of way that we used to plan them. Now, before I end, let me then say, are we doing something with this new line of thinking? And you'll be pleased to know that we are indeed beginning to use this line of thinking very actively. I personally can say this in many, many areas when we are creating new spaces. Many of these through, for example, targeted interventions that encourage certain amount of randomized human interaction. So what are examples of this? For example, in the city of Ahmedabad in Gujarat, we have taken the riverfront and we have redone it. Several, I think a dozen or more kilometers of riverfront has been created. Creates great new space for public space, but also all kinds of other activities. Whether it is sports or new events, new office areas are being built around it. How exactly will it evolve? I don't know. We shouldn't know. The idea is to create spaces that evolve according to the needs of the times. We have done this with old cities as well. One of the places we have done this is in the ancient city of Varanasi, one of the oldest cities in the world. It has in it a very sacred temple called the Kashi Vishwanath Temple. And all around it used to be a really, over centuries, built up dense urban space. Now, conventional thinking about heritage conservation would be that all you do is preserve the way it is. But despite a fair amount of pushback, we decided actually to modernize that area. When I say modernize, we didn't necessarily go and demolish all the old buildings. A lot of them were really beautiful, and we did preserve most of it. But we did also intervene and put in certain modern elements, even some modern buildings in there. Now, you will say, why would you put modern buildings in there? Well, because you see, when you take an organic, evolving view of a city, then we too are a part of that history. We too have a right to add some parts to the elements as long as what we are doing is allowing the old sort of chain or history to play itself out into the future. So when you begin to think about urban design, it even begins to impact the way, for example, you would preserve a historical site. So I'm just giving you very little bit of a smattering of a flavor how a complexity view of urban design can be very, very different and lead to very different conclusions about how to make urban interventions. Gentleman at the back is waving to me frantically, so let me stop here and I'll be around to answer questions. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. It's great to see you. I was just reflecting that I probably have not been in a room or in a conference so full of people in about 3 years. And it feels good, right? It's different. It's like life was on hold for a couple of years. My slides are on. Great. So it's great to be in Singapore as well because reflecting on Chairman Lee's comments, it's really been a place that I've seen sort of the thinking about itself and itself as a city change over time. And I think the perspectives that we're discussing today in terms of embracing the city and its processes and understanding it as a complex system is really begin to revolutionize how you see yourselves and how you see your future. And so my talk will be a little bit in that spirit. I'll touch on Singapore, but My work is as a researcher primarily. We work a lot with practitioners, but mostly I'm an academic. I run a new institute at the University of Chicago called the Mansueto Institute for Urban Innovation, you see here, that is dedicated to studying cities and urbanization through scientific methods. And so it's really a joy to visit the world, see what different cities are doing, very much as Sanjeev was saying, how cities have a life of their own, but also how we're sharing ideas that are trying to create what the future of cities and a better life for us and the environment will be. So with that, I want to say a couple things. So my talk will try to do two things. Try to tell you a little bit about cities as complex systems and what is urban science, but also I'll have an eye towards the future. I want to ask what kind of transformations, as you can see in this slide, cities will have to go through. And we know that if you're younger here in this room, in your lifetime, and probably in mine, we'll have to navigate very difficult transitions, an energy transition. We're already in an energy crisis, as you know. It'll be very hard to imagine Singapore as a modern place without using energy, and so it's critical. There'll be environmental transitions, there'll be issues of equity and inequality that are ripping many cities apart, like the city where I live, in Chicago. And all these things, in some sense, the hope is that we find a model, a way of thinking, a way of working, that will take us through a better future where all these problems are solved together. Okay, so solving these problems together is maybe the mother of all complex systems. And an important question is, at what scale will we be solving and trying to address these problems? And so I'll try to make the case that the urban scale, though not unique, is a very important scale at which a lot of that is happening. And I think you're familiar with that in Singapore and other places. Sanjeev already told us a little bit about how that's also happening in India. So in some sense, we need some tools for the imagination, for ways of thinking, for ways of working that allow us to bring together these themes that cross disciplines, that cross different aspects of the problem. So what happened in the last maybe 15, 20 years, maybe less than that, is that these ideas have been with us for a long time, since in the West, since the Greeks, certainly. In Asia, I'm less familiar with the history of ideas. People have been thinking about cities not so much as built environments, but as social places, political places. Aristotle referred to them as, of course, in terms of politics, which means the stuff of cities, before it meant what it means today. But part of what happened, as Chairman Lee reminded us of, is that we have a lot of data, new evidence, and the world is urbanizing. So what we have is really a way in which all this is coming together to allow us to study what a city is, which is very hard to predict from scratch, right? But compare cities across places, across history. And so we can essentially do historical studies of cities, of our own city, but also going back all the way back. I work a lot with archaeologists and anthropologists, but also looking ahead and starting to think about what the cities of the future will look like. And in order to have this power of extrapolation to new situations, the kind I just showed you, you really need to have something like a science that informs then practice and frames also engineering and policy solutions. So we have sort of an applied field of urban analytics that we'll hear a little bit more about, which is the application of a lot of these techniques emerging. Mostly through data and computation. We have sort of a field of urban science that's trying to make sense about this, the human condition in cities and what cities are as systems. And all of this is interacting in interesting new ways. So when you look at cities and you start asking, how do these things work? You know, and famously, Chairman Lee also referred to this, cities have been described as, probably best as systems of systems within systems. So, you know, they have all the more complicated systems. They have brains and people and ecosystems and road networks and economic systems and markets all together to form something new altogether. And so part of the ideas that are emerging is really a shift in emphasis away from, say, energy systems or land use planning, which are traditional uses of planning, or zoning, which are sort of topical things, but sometimes we may freeze the city or impose constraints that we've learned are not good. In terms of understanding the relations of things in cities, so often you'll see in many of the talks we'll talk about networks, understanding that the city is very heterogeneous, and that means that people and firms and other agents have different costs and benefits from being in the city. The city has to remain open to migrants, poor people who are external, otherwise dies, but also allows very rich people, right, or people with a lot of privilege to live well. So it's kind of difficult to do all that. And cities are wonderful most of the time at doing that, but can also create cleavages that make it rigid. And also ideas of information. These are quite new. Information is critical for complex systems to evolve, to change over time. They need to have information to obtain resources, to manage themselves, and to envision the future. That's in the decisions you make as an agent, but it's also embedded all the way up, including in political systems, firms, and so on. And so it is that information that cities thrive on in particular. Okay, I'll go a little faster. So what kind of problems are we trying to solve in cities? So this is just a sample from the World Economic Forum. I'll go a little bit more quickly through this. And this has to do a little bit how do we make cities sustainable. So a lot of this has to do with engineering problems of materials and energy flow, but it also is a social contract for how people together in these distributed complex systems come together. And this is a certain way in which talk about the feedback loops. This is the simplest of them all. This is often how we start to understand an ecosystem or a system of renewable resources can start to work. You'll be familiar with these equations if you're a researcher probably. But this is just the simplest of all the loops. And once you have a loop, you can have things that run away in a good way and in a bad way. So you can have crashes and booms and so on. And so this is the nature of complex systems. You need to be managing these loops, understanding them, otherwise you're going to get things wrong. And the city or the system will run away from it, and you'll end up with some of the examples we discussed. So in some sense, you can conceptualize a city in terms of a sustainable system sort of this way, in which we're trying to make more and more the materials flow within the city, less globally, and we're trying to use energy, and we try to use sort of a social contract that makes it work. And so part of the question is whether this happens at the household level, at the level of firms and businesses, which are very important, for example, for resource flows, but at the level of the city, or at the level of the nation. So you just heard we got finally some good news from the United States, which has been a mess in these terms, but maybe that's something that is good that's going to happen there. China, for example, has this idea of the ecological civilization that's also tying with in terms of having leadership in the environment. So maybe good things are possible at the national level, but in cities, a lot of things are happening. So this is kind of something I got from CLC, and it has to do a lot with some of the priorities. I think this is CLC's version. I don't know how much this is embedded throughout government for how to conceive the future of a better Singapore as a city primarily. And I think you'll see in these 4 categories that a lot of them, all the language is really the language of complex systems about networks, relations, envisioning the future, envisioning a city that has more opportunities. But all of these are trying to put hypotheses really, not given conclusions, as Sanjeev was emphasizing, about how it might work, how we might get there. So this is a little bit different from planning, just saying it's going to be like this, it's going to be shanty garden, it's going to be perfect. It's just saying, well, you know, we have to deal with these processes and they need to continue to improve, we need to measure them, we need to model them, but we need to be open to them. Okay, so when you do this, you basically have these ideas of a human ecology, of a person connected to other people and to businesses and have a lot of functions, and all this needs to fit together, right? So this is called the human ecology, and it has to fit together over space, over time, over a budget, and different people are different, right? So you can have a person like this, which is abstract, that you can think about in terms of planning, but you can also have somebody with special needs or elderly, which is important. I think we'll hear a talk a little bit about this in the 3D environment, in the panel that in the talks that will follow. So the city has to have these flexibilities and these ecologies and these niches that allow it to function. And it needs to work across many different scales. So the cities kind of occupies a mesoscale in human societies. Below it, we often think about cities this way. There are households and neighborhoods at which a lot of life happens. These are very important as sort of a life support system. But the city really emerges at a larger scale where economic relations, where innovation come together to create something new. So all these scales need to be present and have their place and kind of build up on each other. And you need to understand that as you measure things and model them and, you know, create also national development and so on. So I'm just going to finish with a few examples from cities. This is just how cities are trying to manage this complexity and create long-term plans. So this is an example from Barcelona and has to do with, you know, certain goals about homelessness and so on. That was Tokyo. This is Los Angeles and emissions. This means that cities have to look at many different metrics and try to manage them at the same time. Singapore's doing this through Smart Nation, Smart City programs. And the idea is to create a system that's more self-contained, more an ecology, more like a rainforest that recycles a lot of its goods and information, and less like, you know, an open destructive system that just eats the world away, but will not be sustainable the world, you know, as it goes. So Singapore, in relation to its neighbors and the rest of the world, has a lot of these dilemmas, you know, even political dilemmas. How does it do this? How much of it is internal? How much of it is external? And so every city is trying to do this. And so there's a lot to learn from each other. I'll just finish with this slide. It's a quote from a friend, and in my opinion, one of the greatest designers. He thinks about life as a form of design and the future, sustainable future as a form of design. His name is Bruce Mao. It's about this nature of ecologies and how, in some sense, we need to come to terms with modeling and understanding complex systems as ecologies, and how that's the essence of the kind of science that we're creating, of the kind of cities that we wish to have, but also of the kind of world that we hope to have. So in that sense, I think the future of Singapore, the future of each city has a lot to do about how it sees itself and its future, how it sees itself as a complex system, how it trusts its own processes, and how it has the imagination to guide them to a better future. So we'll have a series of interesting talks about this that will highlight many of these different processes, but you'll see that this is kind of a way of thinking and doing that's alive and that's creating a different way of building the future. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm Ying Long from Tsinghua University. I'm very pleased to be here to deliver the keynote for World Cities Summit. So today, I'd like to discuss the relationship between technology and cities. So let me share my screen. The topic for my presentation is 3 ways to promote urban research and practice with disruptive technologies. So actually, as you know, we are in the era of the 4th industrial revolution, and we are quite familiar with artificial intelligence, big data, mobile internet, and robots, and AIs actually, etc., etc. So actually in the historical books, we are quite familiar with the relationship between technologies and the cities. And right now, we are just experiencing the 4th industrial revolution. So I have very interests with the relationship between technologies and cities. So I like to deliver the talk in 3 parts. That is also my theory about the relationship between technologies and cities. First is City Lab. Technologies are providing new lens for our understanding cities and people. Second, technologies are shaping our people and cities. That is the so-called new city. The last pathway is the future city. How we can create the future cities is also in transition. So first, City Lab. So right now, I think maybe most of the audience today are familiar with the book. The 4th paradigm. Like the data-intensive scientific discovery. And today, we have more and more data to understand the daily life, our city space, for example, the mobile phone data and the smart car data as well. And we also have a lot of trajectories and also the CCTV pictures and videos. They are all providing our solutions to examine the city space and the daily life. I think that is very important comparing the conventional big data or conventional data environment like the yearbook and the statistical information and also the so-called questionnaire, for example. And right now we also have the technologies to collect the data by ourselves, like the active sensing approach. Using the mobile sensing and stationary sensing, and also the hybrid sensing to collect the data for people and for space by ourselves. Our lab is right now doing the research towards the direction. And also we can also do the real experiment supported by the internet platform. For example, right now currently we are in collaboration with WHO Beijing office, CDC China, and also the Ele.me, the food delivery platform, to examine the behavior, to evaluate the behavior change for the salt reduction. For example, we can provide the low salt dish. We can observe the people's behavior change to do the behavior insights. And actually, we are also collaborating with DB, I mean China's Uber, to understand the landscape for the China's transportation behavior, for example. And we can use the open data and also use the DB data to answer the question. I mean, how many functional cities do we have in China? I mean, traditionally, it is not so easy to answer, actually. And right now, supported by DB, and we are regarding the China territory as a lab, and we can answer the question. The pathway 2 is about new city. I mean, since the technologies and new something are providing new opportunities for our daily life and our city space. For example, our space is getting more and more mixed, and ourselves are getting more and more digitalized. That is the new city, I mean. And even some scientists are also advocating the online urbanism and also the platform urbanism. So they are all the new something, contributing the formulation of the new cities. For example, residence, I mean the living space. We have the multi-functional community right now. I think in Singapore, I also visited several community centers. That is very, very brilliant, I think. And we also have the sharing live and also the intelligent operation and management for the real estate properties. And they are the new residents, I think. And right now for the employment, also the work. And right now, how to work and what time to work and with whom to work is also in transition. For example, we have the co-work system, and we also have the remote work and also the digital nomad. Yeah, anyway, there are many new something are redefining the so-called work or employment. That is the new component for city. And also the shopping as well. We can do shopping online. We can also, the location choice for shopping facilities in cities is also in transition. For example, going inward, going upward, and going to the underground space. And also the play. Play is also one of the most important component for our cities. And how to play, for example, we can play online. We can play using the the augmented reality equipment, for example, and we can play on screen. And right now, some of the playgrounds are also in transition. And transport, I think the city transportation has also been redefined. For example, the sharing system and also the EVs and also the autonomous vehicles. They are also redefining our city structure. So they are formulating the new city. I think we need theory, we need science to understand, to evaluate the so-called new cities. And right now, our lab is doing in the direction. The last pathway is the future city. I think since my background is a designer and planner, so we have been quite interested with the this pathway. And right now, before as a designer or planner, we are quite interested with the physical space. And later, participatory design, for social space. And right now, I think information space is more and more important for us, as we know. For example, our daily screen time, for me, is around 6 hours. And our students in Tsinghua, some of them are associating with screen time of around 10 hours. Oh, that is unbelievable, actually. But that is true. That is true. So for the future city, we have also interviewed and also collected a lot of cases for the very famous and the top design companies. And most of them are quite open to the information system or the smart technologies. For example, most of them are doing the digital innovation, physically and socially, like the Internet of Things combined with our physical space, and also the apps, for example, or the information system combined with the so-called conventional placemaking. I think, in my opinion, digital innovation is very, very important for our designers, for our planners, and they I mean, the digital innovation, spatial intervention, and placemaking are together. I mean, proposing a new way for develop the future city. So that is my theory. And right now our space is, right now our lab is collaborating with Tencent in China, and we have developed several reports and projects as well, together with Tencent, and the report is open online, and we are imagining the new open space in the future in the WSpace report. And in the WCTX, that is a future community. We are together with NBBJ and also the AWB. We are developing the technical layer for the WCT project, the new headquarters of Tencent in China, actually. So I think, I mean, that is almost all for my talk today, and for the three pathways: City Lab, New City, and Future City. The last slide is about the positive externality and the negative externality. I would encourage all of us consider the potential negative externalities upon our people and our urban space. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Limin, for the kind introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. As we heard in the three keynote speeches, high-density, livable future cities require new integrated planning and design strategies that acknowledge their scale and the complexity of their systems and networks. In land-scarce Singapore, public and common spaces and networks, traditionally located on the ground level, are increasingly complemented by such spaces and networks on elevated levels in the form of sky bridges, sky parks, sky terraces, and roof gardens. Combinations of these often apply to mixes of residential, civic, and commercial programs, conjoin at times to produce vertical cities in which such spaces become components of larger urban systems and networks. The resulting complex interactions of spaces on elevated with those on ground levels, their impact on patterns of human movement in the city, their contribution to a more livable high-density urban environment, and their scalability are currently not well understood. Urban Science and Design for Density is a research thrust that is part of the larger Cities Research Program at the Singapore University of Technology and Design. In the following short presentation, I will discuss vertical cities, complex emergent patterns of movement and space use in high-density urban contexts, a pilot study that we recently conducted in collaboration with the Singapore Ministry of National Development, the Center for Livable Cities, the Urban Redevelopment Authority, and the Housing and Development Board. The objective of the pilot study was to explore new research methodologies that can address the challenges I just mentioned. One of the key questions we wanted to address in our study was how methods and tools of complexity science could be used to better understand spatial networks and human movement in vertically integrated developments, and subsequently inform and improve the planning and design of future vertical cities. When urban spaces are extended in the vertical dimension, they generate multi-layered spatial networks that are characterized by complex interactions with those on the ground levels. On this slide, you see the composition of our pilot study. In our 6-month-long project, we used Kampung Admiralty, or KA, as a case study to test our new methodology. KA is a first-of-its-kind public development in Singapore that integrates housing for the elderly with a wide range of social, healthcare, communal, commercial, and retail facilities. The development is conceived as a vertical city. It features a stacked arrangement of land uses with public and common spaces and amenities distributed on multiple levels. You can see this well in the exploded axon isometric on the right of the slide. In our pilot project, we had 3 main stages. First, we conducted spatial network analyses. Second, we mapped human mobility. And third, we conducted socio-spatial network analyses. The analysis of spatial networks allowed us to study the significance of public and common spaces in the overall network. It also allowed us to identify expected and unexpected spatial performances of spatial nodes. In our human mobility mapping, we tracked and recorded user movements, activities, and space use in public and common spaces that we had identified as key nodes in the overall development. Finally, we superimposed movement data on spatial networks to generate user activity routes and to understand movement patterns in KA over time. This allowed us to analyze and validate the expected performances, find unexpected deviations, and identify evolving patterns of user-space interactions. We also studied KA's spatial network for its measures of centrality and structure. Centrality measures indicate the significance of nodes and their connectivity strength within a network. We visualize these measures in relationship to the spatial layout of the development. For example, the isometric on the left of the slide shows the community lift lobby on level 1 served as a critical connector within the overall development. In our human mobility mapping, we tracked and recorded user movements, activities, and space use in key public and common spaces within and around KA. For this use, we used bidirectional outdoor people counters with infrared sensors that allowed us to collect inflow and outflow volume data. We combined low-energy Bluetooth or BLE devices with smartphone sensors to track and localize study participants that included residents, employees, and visitors of KA. For our study, we recruited a total of 73 participants and collected approximately 42 million data points. We then analyzed the collected data from the people counters and BLE devices in terms of temporal space use patterns, mobility, and space occupancy. The people counter data provided us with temporal patterns of space use that, for example, indicated consistent peaks for all days of the data collection. We extracted the beacon data for each study participant to map the movement patterns. On this slide, you can see the mappings for a resident, an employee, and a visitor of KA. The resident spent most time in the mid-level social spaces. The employee mainly used the residential lift lobbies and spent considerable time on all public and common levels of KA, and the visitor's movement largely corresponded to that of the resident. The mobility analysis of the beacon data provided us with insights into the movement patterns of users in relationship to spatial nodes. For example, we found that overall, men traveled larger distances per day than women. We recorded the highest movement levels in the level 1 public plaza. This was followed by the public and common spaces on levels 2 and 6 of KA. In our occupancy analysis, we found that users spent most time in the food court on level 2, followed by the community plaza on the ground and the sky gardens on the upper levels of the development. We explored in our analysis possible ways to extract correlations between mobility and occupancy. We found that most spatial nodes displayed prominence of one function over the other, meaning that they were either key movement or occupancy nodes. We established a correlation matrix to show the relationship between network topologies and structure, as well as between the spaces and network processes such as mobility and occupancy. In addition to our statistical analysis, we experimented with visualization methods for the sensor data. On this slide, you see the data shown in relationship to the spatial layout of KA. On the right, you see mappings of beacon points for different days of the week that illustrate different levels of activity. As for results, the study provided us with important insights into the actual performance of KA's public and common spaces. In summary, Our pilot study, established a reliable method to convert floor structure and program to a weighted spatial network. It successfully tested hardware and software required to collect user data. It developed machine learning models to convert sensor data to user activity information. It provided fundamental analyses of the spatial network with tools available in complexity science. It provided a method to visualize network matrix for urban planners and designers. It conducted analysis of human tracking data based on user demographics, and it established a method to study the relationship between topology, geography, and actual user flow in vertically integrated built environments. This slide lists the limitations of our pilot study. Again, this was just a 6-month project. These include, for example, that the study was conducted during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, which meant that social interactions, space use, and pedestrian movements were affected by safe distancing regulations and requirements. Our results are therefore not representing a typical use of KA. Based on the results of our pilot study, we are now planning to apply our methodology at a larger urban scale. Ultimately, our goal is to develop tools and strategies for the planning and design for future vertical cities. This brings me to the end of my short presentation. I would like to thank you for your time and attention.
A very good afternoon to all of you. Indeed, it is an honor and privilege to share the stage with highly accomplished people from different domains. And all the talks so far, apart from Prof. Thomas, was more abstract, was at a higher level. And in line with the previous presentation, this one is also a very specific talk. And I am Nishant Kumar. I'm a PhD student at the Singapore ETH Center. And I did this work in collaboration with my fellow PhD student Yatao Zhang and our supervisor, Prof. Martin Robel. And this is titled Explaining Road Network Resilience Using Spatial Variations of Network Topology. And we specifically focus on Singapore as a pilot. So first I discuss what is resilience. In simplest terms, resilience is the ability of a system to bounce back after a disruption. And this is what we are interested in modeling at FRS. To begin with, I have this impactful, rather sad image of a traffic accident from Singapore, PIE, the Pan Island Expressway. So someone probably died in that, someone was injured, and then there's a traffic jam. So given our background, we are sadly not fit enough to save the lives. Rather, what we can do is to reduce the time required to deploy life-saving services and clear the congestion as soon as possible, so that everything that can be done faster. So as transportation researchers, that is our best bet. So here I have a typical resilience curve of an infrastructure. So there is a disruption, and then there is a loss of serviceability, and over time this recovers. And we are interested in improving the recovery rate of the system, and that is a more resilient system if it can recover faster. So on similar lines, a traffic accident presents us with a similar kind of curve. There is an accident, and then there is a loss of traffic flow, and so several emergency response teams are dispatched, like the ambulance, the police, and then there's a control room involved, and finally the congestion starts to clear up. This also involves the people who make their own decisions. They change routes. They use some route-based services like Google Maps and switch to a different route. Finally, we have the congestion cleared. And the duration between the initial accident and the point where the congestion was cleared, that we refer to as the total incident duration in this study. And that is what we are interested in modeling. So what is the motivation behind this study? In the previous talks, we heard a lot about scale. So we are, as modeling city-specific variables, we are interested in the scales. And what we are particularly good at from a technical researcher's perspective, that we always take the city, we split it into grids, and we do our computation. First of all, it reduces the computational complexity. Secondly, it makes things parallelizable, so we like doing that. But a question which we often face is that how many grids should we split the city into? And this is what we try to address in this research. So we take the city and we take Singapore as our pilot, we split it into uniform grids, and every grid is a road network. It has some graph features, and with those graph features, we try to predict what is the expected congestion clearance time of that grid. And then we vary the size of this grid from very fine to very coarse, and we expect to find a sweet spot which helps us model this easily. So that is the first part. And in the second part, which is the research question 2, we explore the possibility of allowing for heterogeneous grids, moving away from the uniform grids, and then have a segmentation of the city, which can help us better model the TID and hence reduce the congestion clearance time. So here I have some images of how the road network features vary across Singapore. Features like edges, the nodes, number of intersections, average length per intersection. So this is a very nice motivator to show that these road features, they vary across the city, and we start our research with this. So each of these images, they become a feature in the X feature, and then Y is our TID, the total incident duration. So to summarize, here I have our algorithm in 4 steps on the right, in the right box. So first we split the city into uniform grids, and then we organize those grids, each size of the grid, that is, we refer to them as scales. We organize them into trees, and finally we iterate through them. We find the best scales, and then in the final step we propose a region merging algorithm to find continuous regions which help us better model the TID. And on the left, I have a summary of our data. Our data was collected using a commercially available here traffic API. And the unique thing about this is, in terms of what previous speakers said, that we are at a point in time where we have challenges, but we have good data available. And this is a very good example of this. So this whole API is available for every city in the world. So that means our entire method can be shifted tomorrow if we want to a different city. And this is something that we are really working on at FRS, that all our current research is targeted at making it flexible and transferable to a new city. And our best scale comes out to be around 80 cross 80. So that translates to around 250 meter square grids in the city. And that gives us the best goodness of fit if we try to predict the TID using the road network features. And this is more of a computational trick that we did. We organized the scales into trees, and so that they fit in when we split them. And so at the scale of 80 cross 80, here we have, so for the next step, we want to look for the non-uniform grid. So we start with the clusters of accidents in the original uniform grids. And in those clusters, we do a connected component analysis. We find all the regions which are connected. And from there, we allow our split and merge algorithm to go and to search for nearby connected regions and ultimately segment the city. So the segmented city looks like this. I think I have a video of that. Yes. So we start with those cluster centers, and we allow to merge with the nearby regions. And the merging criteria is determined by network connectivity, which is the most important aspect, because we are interested in regions where an ambulance or a police vehicle stationed near the expressway can be easily deployed. So within those whole region, so if you pick up any color, so the whole region is connected. So that means a police vehicle around anywhere in that region can reach the site very fast, and this reduces the time to deploy. And then we also have another notion of topological similarity, where we argue that similar roads, topological similarity, usually the similarity of road features, this implies that roads which have similar number of terms, similar width, they should share the resources. Because if we are talking about very, very, very narrow roads, so probably they need narrower road clearance vehicles. So that is what we include in our merge criterion. And here I have a summary of my results. So before merging, we had absolute percentage of 4.28, and it decreases to 3. Honestly, these are not the kind of results that we were hoping for initially, but that just implies that this problem is more complex than we thought initially. And what we are doing right now is that instead of having a global goodness of fit, we are going into the details, and we want to look at clusters inside the city where there are more and less accidents, and can we model that better? So with this, I have come to the end of my talk. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be open for questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Misha.
Good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, so my work is going to be looking at a very different scale, but we're very excited to be here and investigating the application of complexity science in what is both a kind of a local and global kind of system. So the background of this work comes from my frustration working in an architecture firm called Foster & Partners. We worked extensively on a lot of airports, and airports are a really, really interesting typology because they're huge. In Singapore, Changi's airport is a very substantial part of the country, but furthermore, they take a long time to realize. So often, typically sort of 5 to 10 plus years of government level planning, at least 5 to 10 years design, and then 10 years or so to go through with the construction and finally the commissioning. As a result, they are a very frustrating but also a very kind of rewarding typology to work on. They submit a lot of benefits to cities, but I think what we need to do and think more about is what the long-term kind of needs will be of airports. And this is predominantly why this work exists, is because often the airports that we think about today will only be realized in 2050. So I want to ask the question, what does 2050 look like for aviation, which is invariably a very, very difficult project or thing to do, but we've been working at it for about 3 years now. This is a part of a 5-year project that we are lucky to have been supported by Singapore University of Technology and Design, and also the Aviation Studies Institute in general at SUTD. So whilst in 2020 and 21, the questions about what the future of airports would be has changed was originally sort of very skeptical that aviation might be over, et cetera, et cetera. Fast forward to this year, already demand is huge. Airports are already struggling again to kind of keep up with this. And I think this highlights the issue that we need to think in the much more distant future, if not just because these airports are really difficult to realize. Airports are, for me, an exciting typology. They're truly global. They also, aim to be local. They are a gateway to a country. But more than that, they offer a way of countries building up their economies, their connectivity, and sharing their culture. And what's interesting is that it's a sort of very unique kind of thing where we can see where the demand of going to various places is. And through this kind of very economic model, we can see what the demand is. Airlines are very good at optimizing their traffic flows. There's a lot of complexity science put into that alone. So they represent a really interesting data set to understand where demand is. But if we think forward to where a lot of the current airports that are being thought about now and will be realized in the future, the world's changing rapidly, and very central to this is Asia, naturally. If we look at the change in GDP and the change in population, Asia, Southeast Asia, specifically massive sort of increase in GDP, South Asia population and GDP, and then East Asia a rising GDP increase, even though a sort of a flattening of population. And also excitingly in Africa, there's going to be a growth in population. I'm really interested to know how this will effectively kind of rewire aviation away from what we're very typically used to, which is a very kind of Euro and America-centric view of what aviation looks like. What I'm also excited by is that aviation data is one of these sort of uniquely complete data sets where we literally know every aeroplane kind of in the sky. And we can look at that and I think this data set isn't really looked at enough as a way of sort of really understanding how the world works at a really global sense. So we were very excited to kind of work on this. All of this data, the aviation data is OAG, so that's the sort of fundamental source for all of the aviation data. So we can begin to do sort of simple relationships here. If we look at, for example, this is at a country level, we can look at the relationship between GDP and number of flights per capita. We can see a relatively strong kind of relationship, even if we look at whole country, which obviously is not sort of super accurate. But what we've been specifically doing is looking at if we look at what's called a gravity distance model, so this is assuming that people are likely to travel kind of in an inverse square relationship to how far away another city they might be interested in, we can build up these relationships. So if we look at just GDP by itself, we get a certain look. If we look at it just population, we get a certain relationship. These are both mapped in the y-axis against the actual number of flights for 2019. But if we correlate these two factors, we find that there's actually a very, very strong kind of relationship there. So we're then hence using this relationship as a way of potentially predicting what 2050 would look like as we project these countries into the future. So we've been exploring the application of World Bank and UN data, sort of typical projections for where various cities will be in terms of population and wealth. And this is already its own kind of interesting area, but we're specifically interested in what this will mean for aviation flows. So if we look at the kind of existing map, we can see London, a very big international hub. And what's important is what we're measuring here is PageRank, and we've used other clustering algorithms to identify which are the actual places that really connect multiple cities together, not just driving volume. So if you look at America, there's a lot of volume, but it's actually to not very many other countries. America is relatively isolated by two large oceans. However, what we can see here is that there are a number of kind of countries that really kind of drive what we would call hub status. So Singapore is a very good example of this. It's a city, it's an airport that really kind of combines a lot of demand. And pushing forward to 2050, we see a rapid kind of rewiring of what we see as kind of potential demand in the future. And this is something that we don't have time to kind of fully cover here, but I'm very excited by this idea that we have sort of things like Tier 1 and Tier 2, which are these kind of hubs and mega hub type airports, and there's going to be a lot of demand for these in Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, and India. But there's a question of, are the countries ready, are the cities ready to kind of build these airports, you know, mindful of the fact that this is going to take a while. So we've been trying to model kind of what this reconfiguration will look like. We don't have time to talk about it here, but I welcome you to have a look at the posters out front, and we also have some links on those posters to kind of delve into the data more. But what I'm excited by is that this kind of rewiring on a global scale kind of rebalances some of the typical London is in the middle sort of centricity, and instead it sort of looks at it in a different way. If we look at domestic flights, we see a similar pattern. We're very interested in the application of like more sustainable travel technologies. So actually Europe and so on are probably going to use alternatives to flying. But China and America, because of the scale, are still going to be very dependent on aviation to travel. So this is our kind of interest in sort of what would this world order look like, and we think this is quite exciting. Sort of Tokyo is a very land-constrained place. How is Tokyo going to sort of respond to these pressures? But also really interesting places like Manila and Cairo as well. We see the sort of insurgence of Africa as a true kind of global transport hub, potentially, if we kind of look at this model. What we're also interested in is how we might project. All of these are sort of making assumptions of the fact that we can change a lot of our behaviors. Trips under 500 kilometers could be replaced by trains. We think this is an important thing. All of this modeling assumes that. But obviously that requires contiguous land masses. It's hard to drive trains over water. They're quite heavy for a start. So as a result, this is the issue that we see, that there's still going to be a lot of places that it just doesn't make sense to drive a train or to go by train because it's too far, or it goes over water. And I think in Southeast Asia, that's a really interesting issue. We have many, many islands. How do we connect these correctly is a question. If we even look now, even with the very limited hydrogen and electric technology, it's still possible to replace these flights. But in the future, we see a lot of potential for electric and hydrogen aircraft. And I think that's important because it means that the technology can become a lot more sustainable. I think aviation is very important in connecting everybody. Events like this are an example of that. But we need to make sure that they work correctly. Right. Now, the final part of this is how a city is going to kind of adapt. And this is another poster that we have. And this is an interest in how the city, the actual landscape, will adapt to this. So we've taken over 2,000 aerial images from Sentinel satellite. We've automated this, and we've developed a machine learning algorithm that identifies the land use in 10 km and 50 km squares around airports. And we think this is very, very important. From my experience, it's all about your neighbors with airports. How easy is it to expand or not? So we've sort of automated this process, and we're very interested in looking at this at a very large scale and asking, okay, in existing airports, how easy is it really going to be to expand or not? So we have this concept of adaptive capacity. How much land can you build into that's kind of vegetated or urban or arid rather than built up or has water? Built like already existing buildings or water are very difficult to build into. And what we've begun to do, and we're excited to kind of explore this a little bit more, is to look at how land constraint places are versus how much traffic they have. So this is an inherent kind of sort of clash between two different issues. People that want to get to some place, you know, the meaning of an airport as an important part of the city, but also its kind of friction with the rest of the partners. So we've been exploring this and mapping this, and in our future work, what we're going to do is begin to sort of clash these two things, the sort of global demand as we see it in 2050 and what the capacity, the adaptive capacity existing is, and potentially seem to explore which airports, which cities are going to have to really carefully consider moving their airport away from the existing place, which is often much more convenient, but often much more land constrained in many ways. We can see this with places like Narita, Istanbul recently moved their airport. These are incredibly expensive activities, but I think if we want sort of sustainable, connected cities, we're going to have to think about this very soon. So we're happy to kind of contribute to this research in that way. So we're looking forward to doing that and applying machine learning and AI and complexity science to that environment. So thank you very much.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'll be presenting on the network science-based analysis of evolutionary park systems. So this research has been conducted in the purview of the Dense and Green Cities module in the Future Cities Lab Global, or FCL Global, at the Singapore ETH Center. My name is Anjana Devi Shrikant. I'm a PhD researcher at FCL Global and a PhD student at Singapore University of Technology and Design, and will present on behalf of my colleagues Chirag Hablani, Srilalita Gopalakrishnan, and Daniel Wong, and Prof. Thomas Schroffer. So in the current phase of the Dense and Green Cities module in FCL Global, our research goes from the building scale to the urban scale, with a focus on, on a systems approach to cities. So we study sustainable integrated districts, or SIDs. SIDs may be understood as innovative models for high density and high livability cities. So SIDs aim to realize the potential of urban innovations and system solutions, such as the integration of district cooling and the adoption of electric vehicle charging stations at the district scale to test their performance before scaling up to the larger scale of the city. There's a need to systematically understand the mutual dependencies and synergies between the blue and green infrastructure, the density, economy, environmental sustainability, comfort, and human behavior. So in the Dense and Green Cities module, we use a holistic approach to studying SIDs. So we have a multidisciplinary team studying the architecture, the urban design, social, environmental, economic, and governance aspects of SIDs in Singapore, Zurich, and select cases worldwide. So in Singapore, the cases studied are One North, Jurong Lake District, and Punggol Digital District. One North is a research and business park in the Queenstown planning area that serves as a hub for innovation and test bidding. So the 200-hectare development, master planned by Zaha Hadid Architects in 2003, houses key growth sectors such as biomedical sciences, infocom, technology and media, and startups supported by capabilities in science and engineering. So the district that's planned as an SID also comprises residences, schools, and a linear park running through the district. Parks are increasingly prioritized as agents of urban vitality because of their physical and mental health benefits. So the study of evolutionary parks, in that the built environment evolves over time, becomes a basis for informed planning and design decisions on how to improve the park's connectivity and usage. So in One North Park is envisioned as a significant spatial connector. The park is also planned as an evolutionary park to allow the installation of park features and design over time. The study of the usage of One North Park on a temporal basis will lend insights on its connectivity in the SID. One North Park provides a green corridor that enables the maximization of frontage for user access and connects many of One North's research clusters. Although it was planned as a continuous green space, the road network divides the park into multiple parcels. So in this study, we focus on the built parcels of the park. That's One North Rochester West and Rochester East. That's P3 and P4, as you can see, which are adjacent to the Rochester Mall, hotel, and condominium development, includes a mixed-use retail context. One North Park Biopolis, which is located on hilly terrain, and its context primarily includes office buildings and residential condominium. The parcels Fusionopolis North and South, which both have diverse vegetation to attract biodiversity and are surrounded by office context. And the parcel Mediapolis, which is an elevated park above the MediaCorp office car park, and its context primarily includes office buildings and Tanglin Trust School. So the question we ask, we ask the following research questions. Does One North Park perform as a significant spatial connector in One North? What implications does the park's function as a connector provide on spatial accessibility and pedestrian connectivity in One North? And which design gaps can be identified for further design strategies to improve the pedestrian connectivity of One North Park and in One North as an SID? So the framework of the ongoing study is threefold: spatial network analysis, pedestrian mobility data collection, and spatial temporal correlational analysis. This study uses a spatial network analysis tool called SDNA to model pedestrian movement in the park. The analysis presented today involves the data collected from the use of people counters, and the spatial model developed from the study will be used as an effective simulative model tool for future design of spaces in the park and their effect on pedestrian movement. So a spatial network model was constructed using Rhino and ArcGIS to represent the pedestrian routes in One North. Beyond the localized, so we did it in a radius of 100 meters beyond the park, and we conducted a network analysis to compute measures of accessibility like reach, mean distance, closeness, and betweenness. So for lack of time, I'm going to skip through a little faster. We also used bidirectional outdoor people counters using infrared sensors that were strategically placed in the park. So we have a heat map, hopefully, no. Okay, the heat map, okay, this is a video that's not actually playing, but okay, so this heat map is supposed to show the hourly variation of recorded flows in each parcel of the park during a typical day. Okay, yeah, sorry. But what we're supposed to see is flows which start at 6 a.m. and we observe 3 sharp peaks at 8 to 9, 12 to 3, and 6 to 7. And this can be understood that higher pedestrian activity occurs in One North Park because One North as a district is primarily office context. So these observations that, yeah, again, I'm sorry about the video, but these observations indicate that the parcels P3, P4, that's One North Park, Rochester West and East, and P6, One North Park, Fusionopolis North, are used as transitory spaces when pedestrians commute to and from office. The rest of the parcels are observed as connectors for short origin-destination trips during certain time periods. And the highly mixed-use context for P3 and P4, which is in the Rochester area, can explain the consistently high pedestrian flows during the day. And early insights from our research show that One North Park Biopolis acts more as a barrier, which is P5. It acts more as a spatial barrier than as a connector, which can largely be explained due to the slope of the parcel, if you're familiar with the district. And One North Park, Fusionopolis South, and the Mediapolis parcel, which are P7 and P11, can be better understood as urban attractors themselves rather than connectors due to high pedestrian movement flows outside of usual business hours. So in future research in One North, we will focus on using Bluetooth tracking and localization to study spatial connectivity across the district. So this is a summary of our SDNA analysis. The network model is found to have somewhat strong correlation with what we observed on site with the flows, and future research is also going to account for urban attractors in the spatial network to improve the study of spatial accessibility. Yeah, to summarize, certain parcels of One North Park perform as significant spatial connectors in One North. The pedestrian network within the parcels and the mixed-use context have a significant influence on spatial accessibility and pedestrian connectivity in One North. The parcels which are observed as connectors see a lot of mixed-use context, and thus we also want to overlay it with, this is another video that I think is not going to play. Oh my God. Okay, but the overlay of the people counter data with other geolocated data like city data this is a data set from 2019, gives us insights on the evolution of the park. And this particular data set gives us some spatiotemporal insights on movement in the park and its surrounding context. We hope to gain an understanding of the evolution of the movement patterns and trends in the park parcels and model that in the network so that future design spaces can be modeled in this and viewed to understand pedestrian movement pattern changes. So before I conclude, here are some of the factors we're keeping in mind with our ongoing analysis. We're going to account for urban attractors in the spatial network to improve the study of spatial accessibility. We also hope to overlay people counter data with other geolocated data. It's going to focus on the pedestrian occupancy of the spaces by studying bidirectional pedestrian flows. The development of a social spatial temporal model will analyze the spaces in One North Park with the potential to encourage social interaction. And the spatial analysis of One North Park and the district will be integrated with the study of environmental, social, economic, and governance aspects of the site to provide a holistic systems approach to the study of the SID. Thank you.
I would like to thank the organizers for this opportunity to talk. And my talk is related to location choice of firms, just after that, which is Ajana, which is location choice of human. So, well, with the potential enhanced economic interactions in the cities, there's a high tendency for firms to spatially agglomerate to reap the benefits of the localization externalities, such as the pooling of skilled labor resources, gain in information and knowledge spillover, and also the benefits of external economies of skills. So, well, to reap these benefits of the agglomeration economies, one would like to understand how firms could come together, space together, and co-locate together, especially. And furthermore, they may change their location in sync with other firms that are commercially synergistic to them. So to let me explain the motivation behind what I'm doing. So the aim here is to develop complexity science method by taking a quantitative perspective, and from there we move on to understand the spatial stickiness of firms and how they move, co-move, and co-locate together, where I make use of the method of complex network in the complexity science approach to approach this problem. So in order to draw the understanding of the spatial morphological behaviors and features of firms, we have developed 3 spatial morphological indices, known as the co-occurrence index, the co-change index, and the CA index, which is a region index. So we use the approach of complex network to look at, for example, the co-movement and the co-change of the network of the behavioral aspects of the firms. And from these behavioral types, we try to see some patterns and gain some insights. So the first part, to gain understanding, we have defined something called a region index. This region index serves to evaluate the traits of how the stickiness of a firm to a certain region or space. We have defined an index known as a region index, which measures the stickiness of a trait to a certain region. Basically, it measures the relative abundance of a trait in the region relative to that of all the traits in the same region. So in this talk, the region is either the central area of Singapore or the London region. So our study uses a standard industrial classification to organize and classify the firms based on the business activities. Here are the standard industrial classification of Singapore. Although there are some differences, the standard industrial classification of Singapore and UK are very similar. We compute the region index of the central area of Singapore and the London region to uncover which category of industry is sticky to the region concerned. Interestingly, we found common sticky industries. So these are the information and communication industries, the financial and insurance activities industry, the real estate activities industry, and the professional, scientific, and technical activities industry, since traits within the industry tend to have positive region index. So when we take a closer look at the standard industrial classification of Singapore, we notice that certain sections of industry have its CA index consistently increased or decreased during the period 2009 to 2019. One such industry whose CA index consistently increases is the wholesale bank. In 2009, the wholesale bank already concentrates in CA. During the period 2009 to 2013, more wholesale bank enters the market, and we observe an increase in the concentration of wholesale bank mainly occurs in CA. A similar trend of increase happens again from 2013 to 2019. On the other hand, industrial sector can also seek to concentrate away from CA. One example is accounting and auditing services, where we observe an increase in concentration in Tampines and Woodland. Similar analysis was performed on the London region, where we found certain industrial sectors to consistently increase in concentration in the London region during the period 2015 to 2021. These sectors become more and more sticky to London. Similarly, there are industrial sectors that show a decrease in concentration in the London region over the same period. Spatial co-occurrence measures a tendency of businesses to locate together. We have developed an index to quantify this tendency. Here is a heat map of the spatial co-occurrence between construction firms as depicted by their SSIC. The group of firms associated with the green part of the heat map highly co-locate with each other. This is further illustrated in the map shown here. Those in the red region has low spatial co-occurrence. From the heat map, we can obtain a co-occurrence network after specifying a threshold. The co-occurrence network reveals a set of traits that tend to co-occur together. For the case of Singapore, we observe the cluster of traits in construction, the cluster 1, finance and insurance activities, cluster 2, and the wholesale, retail, trade, and professional, scientific, and technical activities, cluster 3, tend to occur together. On the other hand, the co-occurrence network of the London region is more diverse. On the other hand, the co-occurrence network of the UK is more diverse. We mainly observe 2 clusters, with 1 cluster being the traits on construction. The manner of calculating co-change is like co-occurrence, except that the evaluation is done in time instead of space. The evaluation leads to a co-change network, which is shown in Figure 1. The network is complex and it mainly consists of the orange community containing firms related to consultancy services. By further filtering out subsectors that also spatially co-locate each other, we obtain a co-change cum co-occur network, which is subgraph of Figure 1 with 4 main industrial sectors. From the co-change cum co-occur network, we deduce that the subsectors, renovation contractors and electrical work, tend to locate close together and move together. They originally locate mainly in Bedok, but shift their locational preference to Woodlands, Hougang, and Geylang eventually. We have also obtained the co-change cum co-occur network of the London region. Observe the presence of similar subsectors here as those in Singapore co-change cum co-occur network. The common subsectors for those both Singapore and London tend to involve activities on services to business, such as business consultancy, IT design, advertising, and construction. So to draw the main insights from our studies, we found that sectors especially sticky to the central area of Singapore and London are information and communication, financial and insurance activities, real estate activities, professional, scientific, and technical activities, with finance and insurance activities relatively stickier in CA than in London. The sub-network of the co-change and co-occurrence network of London is more densely connected than that of the sub-networks of Singapore. The results indicate the applicability of the method of cities in general. In conclusion, the analysis of the spatial temporal dynamics of the firms in this study has enabled us to identify locations which have become more or less attractive for specific sectors over time and which types of firms are more or less space agnostic. We deem the outcome here has policy implications in the urban planning of polycentric cities. So thank you very much for your attention, and sorry I have a breakdown and very nervous this time. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.